Peter Hill Explains, where I invite you to join the science teaching conversation with me about Nic Cusa, a German philosopher from the 15th century, a Christian philosopher, and he stood between the thresholds of the modern world, the modern Descartes and the Enlightenment and the medieval era. And his methodology that he applied with the tools he had at the hand sort of really spookily actually labelled things that the Earth's not the centre of the universe, that stars, there's no edge to the universe. There's a lot of things that he was on the verge of getting correct just through rational reasoning. And so this is going to be the 5th episode as I read through the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for you. Just my insight into it. So this person has an insight that he really can't be classed as Platonic or Neoplatonic, or can he be classed fully as the abstract Christian thinking of Kant, Immanuel Kant, both Germans there. Well, they're not all Germans, but Nic Cusa and Immanuel Kant are both Germans, and there is something to be said about being Germans, and you really have to sort of understand that Germany was heathen or non-Christian for substantially late into the early Middle Ages, and so it was actually the missionary movements into the Norse and the Germans from Britain. Britain was so the Christian civilization sort of bypassed, didn't go directly up to Germany. It went via England, and that Germany was involved very much with the Pope, but in a complicated way, because the Germans, the Franks, the Frankish people from Frankenreich, but from France and Germany, actually provided the power, the manpower, the political stability which led to the Papal State. So it's really back and forth. There's also the fact that Cusa was involved in a council movement, and people sort of dismiss this, but that was very much the way that the Germans did things. They had elected chiefs and juries. This whole thing of this Teutonic thing, which has actually merged into our everyday life, and the idea of electing a chief and having a rotational stage was again from a Teutonic idea that was very much involved. The way that it was done as a sort of a very early form of democracy, and Nic Cusa was trying to work through this, a foot in both worlds, the German world and the religious papal world, but we tend to only see things through the eyes of the papal world because it's got got big churches, people which can be identified. It's a lot harder to actually see the effect of a culture which has been swept away, which is the Saxon and German culture, all the way extending up to where people were. There's a famous saint, I forgot their name, a saint with an axe, and his great claim to fame was he went around cutting down German sacred trees. Okay, this one is 2.2.3 of the encyclopedia, and we're going to bash our way through it because it's not a thing for taking it lightly. Let's read through it and let's consider what everything is said. This is called the measure of knowledge. But this sketch of our knowing powers is assimilative, does not settle what it is normative for human knowing, what it means to take the mind as a measure. It's pretty interesting type of stuff. Nicholas takes up explicitly a bit later in chapter 9 of the Layman about the mind, which is Idiota Dementa, when he questioned how the mind can be measured adequate to such a variety of things, a layman responds somewhat cynically. Now, this is a quote from the book. in the way an absolute face would make itself the measure of all faces, when you attend to the fact that the mind is a certain absolute measure that cannot be greater or smaller since it is not restricted to quantity. And when you attend to the fact that this measure is alive, so it measures itself, as if living to encompass where to measure by itself, then you grasp how it makes itself into a concept, measure, or exemplar, so that it attains itself in everything. Unquote. Now, this is interesting because this is really Plato's theories of the forms mashed with Christian theology. It's quite interesting. Earlier, the layman, so the layman is someone, so he's introduced, rather than the highfalutin person, the average man working his way through. And you can imagine his sermons were really bad. Earlier, the layman had described the human mind as a measure that sets limits, conceptual, linguistic boundaries to all that it knows. What this presupposes are that the requirements of any measuring, quantitative or qualitative, there's 4 requirements. 1, something is measurable to be ascertained. A measure is a criteria or norm embodying a standard units. The actual measurement employs the norm. The result of the process, the measure taken. This is interesting. I said before about how scientific things have 4 things. So I scratched my way to do it, and this corresponds to the actual scientific measure. So scientific measures of a physical quantity rather than an abstract quantity like the sides of a triangle would be a number, a quantity, the error associated with it, the unit associated with it, and the 4th thing I forgot when I was at last episode is the context. You've got to say it's the height of a tree is 100 meters plus 100 plus or minus 10 units, meters on the 10th of December in the American redwoods at such and such a point. Okay, put this, and this is interesting that this corresponds to it. Just reading here, I haven't read this in advance. All these requirements can be found in the passage above. What we want to know counts as cognitively measurable, such as a variety of things. These knowable span items in the natural world and the cultural sphere and their features, as well as concepts in the realm of thought itself. If the concepts measured or exemplar is a qualitative norm the mind employs and of which is its source, the mind does the actual measuring, measures by itself and makes itself a measure or norm in judging, taking the measure of each item across a range of things it knows. What results is the knowledge we obtain when the mind becomes, quote, equal to such a variety of things, unquote, and, quote, attains itself in everything, unquote. Our knowledge includes what we gain from the everyday experiences of society, from the natural and human sciences, and from literature and the arts. Now, this is sort of, I don't know, a naive way of thinking, because there's actually game theory involved in knowledge, or the way that we actually attain knowledge or frame knowledge, that is, whether we have the knowledge itself or whether it's politically acceptable, the knowledge, the social value of the knowledge, and sort of a higher level. There's a whole lot of things going in. So this is what I would class as a naive first look. Next paragraph. What does the reference to, quote, absolute face, unquote, in the passage quoted come to? Absolute, quote unquote, is a term Cusanus, which is Nic, usually reserved for gods, the infinite one, free from every limitation and restriction. Here it is transferred to our minds as images of God. Our minds are not limited to quantitative measures, and thus can determine the conceptual measures or units that best fit the adequate to different sorts of things we want to know. We can answer the question of what sort, or just not just of how much. Our concepts and judgments are assimilative or actively likened to what we know, because we construct the conceptual measures appropriate, if never wholly adequate, to what we are investigating or thinking about. As thus relatively unrestricted or absolute, our minds can be conformed to whatever is knowable in whatever way we can grasp it. Just as the absolute divine face or mind is an infinite measure of all creaturely minds that it images, so the human mind measures the determinate conceptual realities that reflect its own infinite unity or oneness. It's sort of Plato theory of the forms, but added, well, Plato's theory as a form doesn't have a central god in it, but this one does have a central god in it. This extends it all. But it assumes that everyone is honest, no one's tricking anybody. Next paragraph. Human concepts are measures insofar they involve choice and construction, application, and interpretation, whether quantitative or qualitative. The use of a given group of concepts or particular scheme of ideas or interpretive framework is a matter of human creating. If we recognize some mind-independent phenomena we want to explore and come to know, whether it is nature or in culture, we should also recognize that it is up to us to construct and employ the appropriate cognitive measures in order to take the measure of the state of affairs in question. Being introduced to some cognitive domain or area of practice we are unfamiliar with involves learning a new vocabulary, a set of ideas already utilized and standard in that area. Unless and until we understand the concepts and language in the question, we cannot make sense of what we perceive and continue to understand in our previous terms. So you've got, I suppose, Clune, paradigm shifts coming in here. Well, it presupposes that, and also transdisciplinary studies, transdisciplinary studies, that is, between different disciplines. Nicholas is usually measuring in the sense is brought home to us by a metaphor he employs in the passage quoted above from chapter 6, where he says the mind is, quote, a living compass that measures by itself, unquote. In contrast with a fixed or non-adjustable straight ruler, a compass or caliper can be adjusted to fit a range of sizes and shape. Canos' fancifully, quote-unquote, living compass reminds us that as knowers, we can actively accommodate our ideas to what we want to know, as the compass can be adjusted to find the quantitative measure of a variety or sizes and shapes, so our minds are able to fashion, adopt, and modify and utilize the literal and symbolic ideas and concepts available to us for exploring the understanding of the natural, social, and conceptual worlds we inherit and extend. This may help us understand why Nicholas' sketch of mens, so that's mens, not the word, mens is Latin, I think, involves both mind-independent things and the mind itself as normative measures of assimilation, that is, human cognition. We become like the knowable features of things we know and the conceptual and judgmental measures whereby we take them into ourselves as known. The full determined intelligibility of the mind-dependent things and states of affairs provides a kind of ideal limit that we acknowledge in recognizing the inadequacy and shortcomings of what we do and know about them. That's why Nicholas deems our knowledge as conjectural, which is, of course, scientific. All scientific knowledge is conjecture. There's some pretty amazing facts. I think, as an educationalist, this is not the right material to. This is too complex to actually roll out in a school and say, but it's interesting to look at. As long as providing the ideal limit to what we know, things outside the mind also stand as reference that themselves measure our cognitive assimilating. Recognizing that they exist, we also acknowledge that they are what our knowledge is about. And we constantly return to what we seek to understand to assess the adequacy of our conceptions and to correct any mistakes and misinterpretations in our interpretations. Deprived of these independent measures, our knowledge has no reference outside the mind and no standard of revising or improving our conceptual measures as more or less adequate to what we are trying to understand. Which is the fundamental thing. This is an interesting thing in a failed state. So, like all states are in a process of failing, but in a failed state, the actual processes which kick in are not there, not provided by society. So people don't measure the inadequacies of their, they wind up not measuring the inadequacies of their assumptions, and therefore that's almost like a sign, like a feeling the temperature. So if the failed states like, this is my own view, is the failed states like, you can go around and measure the temperature of a failed state by seeing the number of people who can't actually work out that what they're doing is inadequate. Cusa answer, which is Nic's answer, then to the question of whether the mind or the mind-independent realities are the measures or of what we know, may thus be seen as an attempt to have it both ways. We are both measured by the things we know, and we construct the concepts and conceptual frameworks whereby we measure them, however conjecturally. There is situations in reality we want to understand that challenge us to adjust to what we perceive, examine and experience. So too there are situations in reality that require us to modify our ideas and concepts and symbols so that they will be consistent with one another and with the rest of our beliefs. Nic Cusa A thus combines the metaphors of Aslimato and Mensuro in his account of what he provides the cognitive norms or criteria of a human knowing. We cannot resolve the tension between the two that we find in what we say. It must hold on to it. The reason is that as gods, images we do not create, but must recognize what God has created as independent of human knowledge. We may fashion the interpretive measures whereby we know created things, but we do this while acknowledging the full intelligibility of each determinate reality is ultimately identical to God's unknowable oneness. We may aspire to full intelligibility, but can reach only in mathematics. That is why our best knowledge, even of the mind itself, remains conjectural, sharing God's truth, but with limited human ways of knowing. So, look, I think you can easily dismiss this by saying, God, I don't believe in God. I think in modern reinterpretation of this, you have to say God is we don't know what God is, but our assimilation of, and I'm going to get canned for this, our best guess of what he would consider God. Okay, it's not like we don't think it's God, but what he would identify as God as absolute knowledge is what we're going for is the solid scientific facts and theories. It's hard to do. It's in terms of like we are really constructing a form of God for ourselves. So God, if you did God's job description, we're now sort of redefining it, redeploying it as the description of science. Thanks for listening for episode number 5. Another podcast, another story comes to a close. It's been a pleasure sharing this moment in time with you. May you discover truly amazing things, understand them, and tell others. Thanks for listening.